Bueno, hitz batzu esango ditut euskaraz, esateko pozandia dela ILCLIn berriz izatea. Zen aspaldi bat ez nuela aurkezpenik egin hemen ILCLIko mintegian, eta horra duela urte bete edo kepak luzatu zidan konbidapena onat etortzeko, eta azkenean data bat atzeman alizan dugu eta hortxe gaude, eta poztandia da, espero dut etzaretela gehiagia espertuko. Normalki pentsatzen dut oren bat edo ordu bat iraunen duela aurkezpena, eta gero izaten aldugu horako solasaldi bat edo galderak. Well, for those of you who don't know me, as Kepa said previously, my main research domain has been and is the semantics and pragmatics of space in language. I also worked on other topics, for instance in discourse connectors many years ago with some colleagues of Toulouse and Nicolas Ascher, but my main domain has been that of spatial semantics. For a long time I was working on the semantics and pragmatics of static space, and mainly on the semantics and pragmatics of adpositions, cases, and what linguists name adnominals. That includes both adpositions and cases. I also worked on the classifications of spatial entities that underlies spatial descriptions, a kind of not philosophical but linguistic ontology of spatial entities in spatial descriptions. And a third axis of my previous research was also the semantics of partware relations, spatial partware relations, not temporal ones, in spatial descriptions. So 12 or 13 years ago, after working for a long time on static descriptions, I turned to dynamic descriptions of space, and so descriptions that are based on or that denote motion, movement, displacement. When I started preparing this talk, I had two options. So one option was to present you a very specific work on one verb or category of verb among some studies I have been carrying out last years. And another option was to provide you with a more a whole panorama of the theoretical framework that I tried to build up the last decade in order to account for the semantics of spatial descriptions in French, but as I will underline, with the idea that perhaps this theoretical framework could be used to describe all the kinds of linguistic data in other languages. So finally I choose the later option, that of giving you a whole panorama of this research, and the title is Semantic Framework for the Analysis of Motion Expression in French, an Overview. As you probably know, the domain of space in linguistics and in semantics is a quite recent domain. I mean, as a really structured, organized, and systematic domain of research. Research in this domain truly started 13 years ago in 30 years ago in the 18th of last century. So 30 years are not so a long time in research. If you compare, for instance, with works on tense, grammatical aspect, or for which some work began a century ago. And when this research on space began in the 80s, there were several researchers who played a great role in structuring the domain. One of them is Claude van der Loise, I will mention it, who was a Belgium researcher, but teacher in USA, in Louisiana. And another one was Leonard Talmy, Len Talmy, who is very famous across the world. And among Talmy's seminal work, there is a chapter, or a very big article, a paper he published in 1985 on lexicalization patterns, that is to say, the patterns that different languages use when referring to dynamic events, spatial dynamic events, so when referring to motion. And his claim was that there were two main patterns that languages used when referring to such situations. And Talmy's work on lexicalization patterns was mainly based on the path-manner opposition. I will give some explanation about this. And in fact, this work has given rise to many studies until now. Here I put dozens, but probably hundreds and perhaps thousands of papers, both in linguistics and in psycholinguistics. The main idea of Talmy, or remark, the basic remark of Len Talmy, is that, for instance, if I use the sentence Max walked into the room in English, you see that the main verb, walk, refer to the manner component of motion, and that the verb is associated with an adposition that Talmy calls a satellite into, that denotes the path. So the manner is expressed by the verb, walk, and the path is expressed by a satellite, which is more peripheral in comparison with the verb. If I try to refer to the same situation but with other languages, for instance, with Spanish, French, but it is partly true for Basque, also for Euskera, I will say Max est entré dans la pièce en courant. Max entró en el aula, en la sala, corriendo. Here we see that the past component is not denoted by the preposition but by the verb, entrer, entrar, sartu, and the manner will be expressed by peripheral elements and by adverbials or by gerunds, for instance. Corriendo, en courant, or ibilis. The typology that Talmy built with these remarks was based on the observation that what is important for Talmy's typology is where the past component of motion is expressed in the sentence. So in English, it is expressed by the satellite, not by the verb that expresses manner. So it is a satellite verb, satellite frame language. And in French, in Spanish, or in Euskera, the verb will express the path. So it is a verb frame language. So this is more or less the basis of Talmy's description. But when you start observing the literature, and as I said, there are dozens of work in this domain, you immediately see that there is a variety of views on the past notion. Many times the past notion is not defined in the papers. It is like an intuitive notion. And there are quite important differences, even not defined when you go into the papers from a paper to the other. So it is quite difficult to make comparisons between the results of these works because of these differences in the definition of the notion of past. And there are also very few detailed analyses of manner, but I will, if I have time, I will say a word about it in the conclusion. Beyond this, there were a lot of discussions about this opposition between verb-framed and satellite-framed languages, in particular with Slobin and Berman and Slobin, who noted in these papers that there are, in fact, many languages across the world that have more than one verb are the core element of the sentence or the clause. That they can have two, three verbs as the core verbal element of the sentence. These languages are called, for instance, serial verbs languages or core verbs languages. And Berman and Slobin remarked that in these languages, for instance, if you have 3 slots, verbal slots in the clause, you can use one to express manner, the other to express path, and so you can't classify it as a satellite frame or a verb framed because the manner which is supposed to be peripheral in a verb frame languages here is put at the same level than the past, because you have several verbs, one expressing the past, one expressing the manner, and you can't say that one is more central than the other or the other more peripheral than the first one. So they called these languages equivalent languages, and they argue that in fact, the typology that Talmy proposed was not a kind of a typology with two dual or exclusive categories, but they were a kind of continuum between verb framed and satellite frame languages with equivalent languages in between. So here we have some of the discussions that to which Talmy's categorization or typology gave rise. Then in 2006, Levinson and Wilkins published a quite important book whose title was Grammars of Space. And in this book, Levinson and Wilkins put together some studies that were carried out at the Max Planck Institute at Nijmegen about a dozen languages around the world from different language families and areas. Here you have the list of languages. And it was the conclusion of many years of work with, in principle, the same methodology for all these languages. And in the conclusion of this book, Stephen Levinson and David Wilkins tried to make a comparison both for static space and for dynamic space between all these languages. And they claimed that it was not possible, even with this dozen of languages, it was not possible to classify them with the verb frame, satellite frame, and path manner opposition, because these notions were not couldn't be applied to some of the languages in the sample. And so they didn't only question the kind of opposition like Slobin that were between verb frames and satellite frame languages, but they went a step further and they questioned the very notions at the basis of the typology. And so they wrote, we need a better understanding of the underlying components of motion conceptualization before we can get much further with the typology of how these are differently conflated in different language types. So they question the basic notions themselves. And they are returning to the need for a better understanding of the semantic components involved in motion events. One crucial notion here is the notion of motion itself. It's very important. They mean that even how languages conceptualize and handle the notion of motion is not clear. So Levinson and Wilkins' remark goes beyond the habitual debate on the difficulties raised by a strict opposition between verb frame, satellite frame languages, the greater or less importance of path, manner, saliency, etc. They question the validity of the notions of path and manner themselves for analyzing the expression of dynamic space in language. But I have to acknowledge that this remark that was very important of Levinson and Wilkins didn't have much repercussions in the following works, and much people followed with Talmi's typology. So here in this presentation, I will try to present you the theoretical framework I developed the last decade in order to capture the semantics of predicates of autonomous motion. Autonomous motion is I walk, I enter the room, as opposed to caused motion. For instance, I put the book on the table, etc. So autonomous movement and motion in French. The basis and different facets and application of the framework have been set out in a series of papers, and in this talk I try to bring together the main properties of the framework proposed and to give an overview of the movement and motion domain in French as structured by this framework. If I have enough time, I will try to show you that the conceptual tools brought out are likely to apply to other verb frame or even satellite frame languages, or at least to suggest it. So the outline of the talk, I will first present the two basic notions I use to categorize motion eventualities and motion verbs, the notion of change of placement and that of change of basic locative relation. And I will show you that with these two notions, we are able to organize the whole conceptual domain of movement and motion in French. Then I will focus on two macro categories of motion display, now in one macro category of motion displacement, which is the category of motion in the broad sense, and we will look at two basic categories that are within this macro category. And in this third part, I will suggest that with these tools, it is possible to arrange all the domain of motion and movement eventualities in French along a continuum of dynamicity. That is to say that some predicates are more dynamic than other ones, which are closer to staticness. And in conclusion, I will sum up the key features of the framework, and I will just suggest that probably, and that's something I want to develop following the next years, this framework can be used to propose a new typology of motion expression in language, which could be an alternative to Talmi's typology. So, the first notion that I use in this conceptual notion that I use in this framework is the notion of change of placement, which is also called translocation in other approaches, and Talmis itself use something which is quite close that he calls translational motion. So what is a change of placement? A dynamic spatial situation or eventuality is a change of placement if the position of the located entity, which is in the literature, which is called target or trajectory or figure, if the position of the located entity within the terrestrial reference framework changes during the eventuality. For instance, if I work in this room, my position in the room and in the terrestrial reference framework changes during the eventuality. I'm not always at the same place. This notion allows to put aside verbs and situations that only entail internal changes of a target, of a located entity, without this entity as a whole modifying its position within the terrestrial or Earth's reference framework. Examples of these verbs are typically verbs of change of posture, like, for instance, s'agenouiller, s'asseoir, s'étirer, to kneel down, to sit down, to stretch. If I sit down, the positions of my different internal parts change, but the position in the Earth's framework of the whole entity is not modified. I can sit without changing my position within the room, standing exactly at the same place. So this notion of change of placement allows to put aside verbs like of posture, like s'agenouiller, s'asseoir, s'étirer, etc., and that can be opposed to verbs like avancer, foncer, glisser, so to advance, to move forward, to tire along, to slide, to climb, that need a change of placement in the Earth's reference framework. Talmi, in fact, has also a name to speak of verb of change of posture. He calls them self-contained motion, because the motion is contained in the target. The parts move, but the whole entity does not move within the terrestrial frame of reference. The second notion I use in this framework is the notion of change of basic locative relation. It is a notion that was fully defined by a French linguist, Jean-Paul Boons, in 1987, but that was already present, even not defined in previous research, for instance, of Geoffroy Leach in the 60s, end of the 60s, about the semantics of English words, or in the famous books of Lyons in semantics. Boons aims with this notion at differentiating movement eventualities, and in particular posture verbs that I pointed out before, from true motion displacement, and in particular strict motion eventualities like aller plus preposition aller à, arriver, atteindre, entrer, etc. So to go plus preposition, to arrive, to reach, to go into, to enter, etc. A change of basic locative relation. How we can define a change of basic locative relation? It is based really on linguistic observation, and a change of basic locative relation has to be built from a spatial adposition or preposition or postposition or case of the language under examination. So I will illustrate it with two verbs, s'asseoir and entrer. If you take the semantic content of s'asseoir, to sit down, the semantics of s'asseoir is not reducible to the negation and further assertion of the relation of support contact. Naively, you can think that finally to sit down is not to be in contact with a chair and then to be in contact with it or in support contact after sitting. But it is not true, because an example is that you can sit on a chair while before sitting, being already standing on the chair. I can go on the chair, standing on it, and then I sit on the chair. So we can see that the semantics of s'asseoir cannot build from the negation and the further assertion of the French preposition sur, not to be on and to be on. In fact, the semantics of s'asseoir, it's a complex predicate, and its semantics is simply to not be set down and then to be set down. On the other hand, if I take the verb entrer, to enter, in this case, I can express its semantics through a preposition of French. Its semantics will be not to be in, it's the preposition down of inclusion containment, and I can express the semantics of entrer through the negation and further assertion of être dans, not to be in and to be in. Thus, because I can express the semantics of entrer with a basic locative relation and through a change of basic locative relation, Boons consider that it is a strict motion eventuality, while here for s'asseoir it is not possible to express it with a preposition, and it is other kind of dynamic verb. It's a verb of movement, of change of posture, but not of displacement and motion, and true motion. The criterion of change of basic locative relation, as I just illustrated, is likely to put apart verbs of change of posture, like s'asseoir, se coucher, but also verbs of change of placement, like marcher, se promener, etc. If you take, for instance, the sentence Max a marché, s'est promené dans le parc, Max walked, strolled in the park, okay? you can observe that the wall, here the landmark is the park. And if we observe the spatial relation of the target with the landmark, the park, all the eventuality of walking or strolling can very well take place without going out of the park. So the wall eventuality can take place within the landmark, and there is not here also there is not any kind of change of basic locative relation with respect to the park. So Boons's criterion allows us to put apart not only verbs of change of posture, but also verbs of placement. However, in a paper I wrote more than 10 years ago, I showed that this notion, even interesting, had some problems and was not fully operative. And this is because at the time when Boons wrote his paper, there was another Belgian researcher, Claude van der Loise, I already mentioned him, who wrote a book that then later on was translated to English at University of Chicago Press. A very important book where he showed that the semantics of spatial relations and prepositions, in particular in languages, cannot be reduced to geometrical features. Not only on the one hand, the geometry which is involved in the semantics of spatial marker is not the classical geometry we learn at school, but this kind of spatial markers involved in their semantics what he called the functional content. Functional content is a content related to the way entities in the work function. For instance, not only geometry, their orientation, the way we use them, the fact that they are submitted to some forces, for instance, gravity, which is not just geometry, so forces, naive physics, etc. And the point here is that in spite of Boons' remark, we can, for instance, negate and assert the content of a spatial proposition by only negating and asserting its functional content without a true motion occurring in the world. I will give you an example. For instance, if I take a sentence like Max s'est placé face à la fenêtre, the translation is Max positioned himself facing the window. Okay, so in French here there is a complex preposition face à, être face à. In English, there is not an equivalent. It's a gerund, facing. So in this case, we can perfectly describe the situation, saying that before positioning himself facing the window, Max was in this position, and then he positioned himself facing the window, just turning on the very place where he was, swirling around. And here we can say, following Boons' proposal, that we have a true negation and then assertion of preposition. And still, we don't have a change of position in the terrestrial reference framework, because I stay in the same place. So Boons' proposal has some problems. There is another remark which is more linguistic. 20 years ago, in a work I published with Dejan Stojic, we remarked that in French there is a test, a very operational test to decide whether a verb is a strict motion verb, and is the modification of if a verb is a true strict motion verb, the sentence can be modified by a prepositional phrase added by par. For instance, I can say l'oiseau est entré dans la maison. This sentence: l'oiseau est entré dans la maison par le jardin. The bird went into the house by the garden, if the house has a garden. So here you see the verb is entrer, and I insert the PP par le jardin, and I have no problem to interpret the sentence. And when you apply this test to a series of verbs, there is a very strange phenomenon with change of basic relation that are based not on the inclusion containment relation of entrée, but on verbs that involve rather the relation of support contact, like sur. For instance, se poser, se percher, to land, to perch. Here, at least in French, it is very strange to modify the sentence with a par. L'oiseau s'est posé, perché sur la maison par le jardin. The bird landed perched on the house by the garden. And there are many examples like this that show that for this kind of predicates that involve not the inclusion containment relation, but that of support contact, even you have a change of basic locative relation from not being in support contact to being in support contact. The linguistic test, which is supposed to categorize the verb in the category of strict motion, show that the verb does not qualify for this category. So the question was Boons' Boons' notion of change of basic locative relation seems to be operative and interesting in some cases, but it has some problems that what we do now to characterize this category of strict motion. So in fact, I remarked that the problem came from that, in fact, we have not to put aside the notion of change of basic locative relation. It is definitively interesting, but strict motion needs change of basic locative relation plus change of placement. It needs the associations of the two concepts to characterize an eventuality of strict motion. And this is directly related with this opposition between s'est posé, s'est perché, et entré. Some changes of basic locative relation, for instance, down, locating use of arm, so other thing, entail a concomitant change of placement. That is to say, if I enter the room, the change of basic relation with respect to the landmark will be accompanied by a change of placement in the terrestrial frame of reference, while other ones, like être face à, which the example was Max s'est placé face à la fenêtre, to change only the orientation, is not accompanied by, it does not need a concomitant change of placement in the terrestrial frame of reference. So this was the first step of my research 10 years ago, and what has to be underlined here is that the two notions are evaluated with respect to distinct reference. The change of placement, the change of position is evaluated with respect to the terrestrial Earth's reference framework for the change of placement. And for the change of basic locative relation, the reference which is used to evaluate this notion is not the Earth's reference framework, but is the landmark of the description. And what is nice is at the beginning I was only characterizing strict motion eventualities, but then I remarked that there was a nice outcome of the analysis in there. The interaction of the two notions in fact gives rise to a rich combinatory that structured the whole conceptual and semantic domain of movement and motion in French. In a way, if you know something about Actionsart and internal aspect, in a way similar to internal lexical aspect and the properties of bounding. Here are three properties, but bounding, punctuality, atomicity, and opposition versus permanency. Basically, the classification proposed by Zeno-Wandler for aspect. I don't say that it is the same classification, but I mean that Wandler could organize all the domain of Actionsart with 2 or 3 notions, and here you get to a full organization of the movement and motion domain with these 2 notions. So there are 4 categories. There are two features, so there are 4 categories. It's quite logic. 4 categories that follow from these 2 notions. One is the case where you have a change of basic locative relation and a change of placement. I call it change of relation placement because it's a very long denomination. Then the case for which you have only a change of placement, so simple change of placement. You have another case, which was the case with the preposition, the relation of support contact, for which you have only a change of basic locative relation without an accompanying change of placement. And then you have a category for which you have neither a change of relation nor a change of placement. I will go through these categories and remind you some examples of verbs. So the first category that at the beginning I was trying to characterize involves both a change of relation, of basic locative relation, and a change of placement, change of relation and placement, and which is called also strict motion, and it involves verbs like in French aller plus prep, arriver, atteindre, entrer, se rendre, sortir, etc. Then you have cases for which you have only a change of placement that I also call motion in the weak sense, as opposed to strict motion, or motion in the strict sense. These are verbs like avancer, foncer, glisser, grimper, marcher, patrouiller, zigzaguer. From a linguistic point of view, there is an interesting contrast between these 2 categories, is that here the notion of change of placement, I told you that it was evaluated with respect to the terrestrial frame of reference, and we will see that it's a continuous event. All are atelic verbs. You can move forward for a while, tie along for a while, slide for a while, etc. But all the verb of change of relation and placement, because you don't have only the change of placement but the change of relation, all here are atelic verbs, aller, arriver, atteindre, etc. Then you have simple changes of relation, like we saw verbs based on the relation of support contact, like se poser, se percher, etc. And then we have verbs that like both notions, for which you don't have a change of placement in the Earth's reference framework, and you don't have, you either have a change of basic locative relation with respect to the landmark. These are mainly verbs of change of posture, but not only, and I call them verbs of change of disposition. So here, this table summarizes the 4 categories. So I will begin from category 4, strict motion, for which you have change of placement and change of basic locative relation. Then here you have a category for which you have a change of placement but no change of basic locative relation, so avancer, foncer, grimper, etc. Then the category of simple change of relation, only change of relation without change of placement. And finally, the category for which you have neither change of placement nor a change of basic locative relation. Linguistic research on the expression of dynamic space in French were very early concerned by the distinction between movement and displacement. In French, mouvement, déplacement. Basically, movement was intended to include verbs like s'asseoir, se coucher, where you have a change of posture but not real motion across a room, for instance. While displacement was not only to sit down but to walk or to run, etc. And all the literature, and for instance, Tenière is concerned with this distinction. The notion of change of placement, change of position in the terrestrial frame of reference is a fundamental tool for such a purpose. And then this notion allows me to define not only the 4 categories I just showed you, but 2 macro categories of verbs and eventualities that can be distinguished according to the absence versus presence of a change of placement. These 2 macro categories are, on the one hand, spatial dynamicity without motion or displacement, and on the other hand, the categories that imply displacement, motion in the broad sense. I will, perhaps it will be clearer with this. It's exactly the same table than before. I only integrate the macro categories. At the right end of the table, as you have a change of placement within the terrestrial frame of reference, here is the true displacement. Well, you have motion in the broad sense that includes 2 basic categories, motion in the weak sense and strict motion. And at the left of the table, you have the macro category that does not involve a change of placement. And this macro category includes the 2 basic categories of change of disposition and change of posture in particular, and simple change of relation. So up to now, with my 2 notions, I have defined 2 macro categories of verbs, eventualities of movement and motion, and 4 basic categories. Each one and each basic category can in turn be divided into subcategories. So we have 3 levels of definition: macro categories, basic categories, and in each basic category we can define in turn subcategories of verbs. So probably I will leave the rest of this diapo aside, and I will try to show you now, as we have these 2 macro categories and the basic categories, I will focus on the right column here in the macro category of motion in the broad sense, and I will focus again in motion in the weak sense and motion in the strict sense, or strict motion, and I will try to show you how these basic categories can be divided out in further subcategories. But it's the same thing for basic categories in the left side of the table that can be also divided up into subcategories. So, within the macro category of motion in the broad sense, so first we have the basic category that I already illustrated of motion in the weak sense, and the motion in the weak sense, that is to say, the category that only involves a change of placement. So, motion in the weak sense or simple change of placement include directional predicates like avancer, descendre, monter, etc. And many verbs of manner of motion like marcher, courir, work, run. There are dozens of verbs of manner of motion in this basic category. Further semantic properties of simple changes of placement are the following ones. They denote a continuous motion or displacement, that is to say, an action or an eventuality of going forward is not telic. It can follow as many, except external constraints, but basically it can last for a long time. There are continuous motion displacement. There are, under specific conditions, cumulative. This comes from Rothstein work on inner aspect in particular. Under specific conditions of spatio-temporal continuity, if I work a little, and work a little again, I can sum up under specific conditions the two events under only one event of walking. Two events of walking can, under specific condition, can be summed up. In terms of internal aspect of state, accomplishment, achievements, etc. These eventualities are activities. Another property, very interesting property, that the terrestrial frame of reference, which is used to evaluate the target's position, is implied, is not represented in the argument structure of the verb. That's for which most of these verbs are intransitive, or at least have an intransitive form construction. For instance, to walk or to run, or marcher, courir are intransitive verbs that does not need a landmark, because the terrestrial frame of reference which is used to evaluate the change of position is not included in the argument structure. It is just implied. Most verbs of change of placement also are, I don't know if you know Levinson and Rappaport work on inaccusative and inergative. These are inergative predicates. There is anyway a nice property in French, but probably in other languages too. There is a subgroup of these verbs. For instance, if as I say, Max a marché sur la terrasse, here. Max a marché, s'est promené sur la terrasse. Max walked, strolled on the terrace for 10 minutes. But it's not only because we have 10 minutes, but this sentence can only have an interpretation, which is that the whole eventuality takes place on the terrace. It cannot be the case that Max walked, and the eventuality ended onto the terrace, like in English, if you say Max walked onto the terrace. Here, Max a marché, s'est promené sur la terrasse. The only and obligatory interpretation is that the whole eventuality takes place on the terrace. But this is not true for all verbs. There is a subgroup of all this category for which we can have not only the interpretation where the whole eventuality takes place in the landmark, but you can also have the other telic interpretation where the target moves and then the eventuality ends up in the landmark. This is the case, for instance, with courir. Max a couru sur la terrasse. Max run. In English, you have on or onto the terrace for the two interpretations, but you can get these two interpretations also in French without changing sur, because in French we don't have another dynamic preposition like onto. But here, in contrast with marcher, we can have the two interpretations, in which the wall running takes place on the terrace, and another one where the running ends up on the terrace. So in a paper 10 years ago, I tried to observe this subgroup and to try to find what were the semantic features that allowed for such a telic final interpretation. So there are four properties a priori. One is speed. Verbs like courir, filer, foncer all allow this second telic interpretation. Then we have another semantic feature which is intentional opposition to a force. For instance, ramper or se traîner, where the target has to be intentional and has to oppose to a force that makes the motion harder to realize. A third property is direction, avancer, dégringoler, etc. And the last property is carrying along or being carried along by a force, like water flowing or somebody who slides or a ball who roll. In all these cases, most of the time, not always, but the target is non-animate, and his movement is caused by a force. I called it being carried along by a force or carrying along by a force. These properties can be grouped together in a family resemblance that underlies the notion of tendentiality. The notion of tendentiality is intended to suggest that even if these verbs are atelic, they only involve a change of placement, they have the ability to tend towards a landmark. And the second interpretation comes from this property. Recently, because this was only a proposition that was the proposition of these features 10 years ago was only based on built or invented examples. And recently I tried to test these properties, but with real data from corpuses, and to precise how this feature operated in the lexicon and could interact with the content of the preposition to lead to the telic interpretation. The second basic category of eventualities or verbs is the category of strict motion. And here again, we have the macro category, the basic category. We can divide it into several subcategories. A very important notion that I already used, in fact, illustrating the semantics of the different verbs, is the polarity of the change of basic locative relation. The polarity is initial if I first assert the change of basic locative relation and then I deny it. For instance, sortir is to be être down and then not ne pas être down, to be in and then not to be in. It is so the change of basic relation is initial because the assertion of the relation comes first. The symmetric polarity, that of final polarity, for instance, entrée, we first deny the relation of inclusion containment and then we assert it. An interesting side of this definition is that many times medial polarity in other works is not defined. And here I defined it exactly in the same way than the two previous definitions. The medial polarity is the assertion of basic locative relation, which is preceded and then followed by the negation of the relation. For instance, is a couper par, to cut across, passer par, to go through a place. Before going through a place, you have not to be in that place, then you have to be in that place, and then again you are not in that place. And in fact, it's probably true in other languages. In French, at least, there are very few verbs that denote or verbal locutions that denote medial polarity. And so then for the study, I left them apart and I focused on initial and final polarity. So we have different parameters for distinguishing subcategories of verbs of strict motion. One is the number and end polarity of changes of relation. Another one is the way of combining with changes of placement, whether these two changes of relation and placement are concomitant or subsequent temporally. The status of each meaning element in the semantic content, we will see an example, whether it is fully including or presupposed or even salient, and the nature of the basic locative relation. So there are several parameters that allow us to define a subcategory. Here I will just comment on four categories. The first one is independent initial change of relation, like partir, s'en aller, to go away, to leave. I will comment the schema. So the semantics of partir is an event E, and the two square brackets here indicates that the semantics of the verbs is centered on this eventuality. Okay, it's centered on this eventuality, and this eventuality consists in the assertion of a relation, which is basically the preposition a in French, and its further negation, to be at, not to be at. Partir, to leave is that, to be at a place, and then not to be at that place. And the change of basic locative relation is accompanied by a concomitant change of placement. Okay, the two are concomitant. We have the event E here, and this is just to symbolize that the semantics of partir is centered on this event. Now, so you see that here we have one change of relation, only one. It is initial. It is concomitant with the change of placement. And I could add that the nature of the underlying preposition, it's a specific one, a specific use of the preposition a in French. Another category is double change of relation with initial saliency. For instance, déménager, to move house, émigrer, s'expatrier, to immigrate, s'exiler, to go into exile, to expatriate oneself. Here we have the schema of this category. We have two changes of relations, an initial one, where, for instance, you leave the initial house, and the final change of relation is that corresponding to the fact that you go into another house, or if it is a country, another country. So we have an initial event E, a final event E prime, and each event consists of a change of relation and a concomitant change of placement. This is initial, this is final, sorry. Because of linguistic properties related to morphology, you can see here that we have always a prefix that déménager, donc D, ex, émigrer, which focuses on the initial change of relation and placement. So there is a kind of greater saliency of the initial change. So here we have two changes of relation and placement, which are concomitant. One is initial, the other one is final, and the initial one, because of morphological reasons, is more salient than the final one. I will briefly comment on these two categories. These are final categories of verbs, final change of relation with integrated prior motion, like aller à, se rendre, to go to, venir, to come. Here you have a change of placement, which is followed by a final change of relation. To go to, you have to first have a change of placement, you move, and then this eventuality of moving ends up on or in some landmark. So you have the change of placement followed. Here they are not concomitant by a change of relation, which is final. And a nice thing is that if you contrast this category with the last one, final change of relation with presupposed prior motion, like arriver, parvenir, aboutir, accéder, you have exactly the same schema, a change of placement followed by a final change of relation. The only difference is that in verbs like arriver, parvenir, aboutir, the change of placement is not directly denoted by the content of the verb, is presupposed. And you can see, I will tell you some examples that prove that it is presupposed. But in a first step, you can really grasp the fact that arriver is not all the motion, but just the final one, arrive, parvenir, to reach, aboutir, to end up. And here we can see that it is a kind of prepositional, presupposed content with the usual test of presupposition. Is that if you deny a verb like aller à or se rendre, for instance, if I say hier Max n'est pas venu au travail, n'est pas venu à l'université, you deny all the content. It means that if I say yesterday Max didn't come to the university, it means that he didn't leave his house. But if I say yesterday, hier Max n'est pas arrivé à l'université, you deny the content which is directly included in the content of the verb, but you don't deny the presupposed content. in usual situation, if you use Max n'est pas arrivé instead of Max n'est pas allé, you mean that he left his house, but for several reasons he didn't reach the university. With these different parameters, we can, here I only illustrated 4 subcategories of strict motion verbs, but we can define 14 subcategories of verb of strict motion. There are further semantic properties of strict motion that can be opposed to those I listed for changes of placement. For changes of placement, we were faced with a continuous motion. Here is a discontinuous motion or displacement because of the change of relation. There are non-cumulative eventualities because if I enter the room once and then I again enter the rooms, you can't sum up the 2 eventualities into one eventuality of going into or entering. There are accomplishments or achievements in relation with Wandler's categories. Other properties are the following. The landmark entity used to evaluate the change of relation is represented in the argument structure of the verb. That is to say, the landmark is always represented in the category. Aléa, the preposition, introduces the landmark. Entrée needs a landmark with respect to which the change of relation takes place. Sortir, all these verbs imply a landmark to be present, and this landmark is present in their argument structure. Most verbs of change of relation and placement are in an accusative predicate. So this is Levin and Rappaport's work. And finally, the 2 notions of change of basic locative relation and change of placement have other nice outcomes. In particular, we saw here, they allow to deduce the aspectual distinction of Wandler from these 2 notions, from their combination. And these notions are also applicable not only to verbs, but also to spatial prepositions. And I will not present you the categorization of preposition that follows from these 2 notions, but it's possible to apply this notion to the content of preposition too. So I will try to end with this part. It has to do with pragmatics. That's the reason for which I want to mention it. The main function of many static and dynamic spatial markers and descriptions in language is to make possible to locate one or several targets or trajectories or figures with respect to a landmark. Not all spatial descriptions are intended to make easier to locate a target with respect to a landmark, but most of the time it is the case that if we describe space, it is to locate some entities with respect to other ones. In fact, Langacker in cognitive linguistics and also Van der Loas noted this property of spatial descriptions, and they tried to grasp it through the notion of search for the target or search domain of the target. The idea is that if I say that the book is on the table, for instance, I try to locate the book to provide you information about where is located the book. And the idea is that I want to make easier for you to search for the target. And for this, I have to provide you with a landmark with respect to which I will locate the target. And I will, if possible, I have to restrain this search domain, not to have to go to search for the book in the wall building, for instance. But this pragmatic function of spatial description is basically a knowledge in many works, in particular for static descriptions. But curiously, and perhaps as a consequence of the past manner approach, many researchers, like last 20 years, left this property of spatial descriptions aside and focused on the opposition between past and manner. And in fact, this pragmatic function of spatial description is also valid for dynamicity. For instance, if you call me, where is Kepa, or Kepa isn't here, I can say you, yeah, he left five minutes ago. But I can also say you, he left for the cafeteria. That is to say, I will not only say you that he is no longer here, but I will also provide you the information about its current localization. So in a previous paper, I proposed to use or to implement this notion of search for the target in the dynamic domain, not only in the static domain, with a related pragmatic principle that was the principle of preference for the positive current localization of the target. It is exactly the example I gave you. If I say Kepa left 5 minutes ago, knowing that he left for the cafeteria, I'm not providing you all the information for localizing him. And I have to provide you with the positive or current localization, not only the fact that he is no longer in the previous landmark. And this pragmatic principle is partly responsible for asymmetric description of motion eventuality that have been noticed and studied for a long time. I don't know if you heard about it. You know the opposition between source and goals in spatial descriptions, and the fact that has been noticed that in many languages there is a bias towards the goal, to indicate the goal rather than the source of the displacement. And an hypothesis is that a principle like this can contribute to such a bias. And the principle can be seen as a kind of, I don't know, of instantiation of the quantity maxim, for instance, of Grice, because if I know that Kepa went to the cafeteria, but I don't provide you with all the information, I'm not fulfilling the maxim. For dynamic space, as opposed to static space, a crucial role of spatial markers and description is to be able to update a moving target's location, because the difference with static space is that the target is moving. So I have to be able to, through my description and through the verbs or preposition I will use, to update the moving target location. So the notions of change of placement and update of location lead to arrange the whole domain of movement and motion along a continuum of dynamicity or staticness. You have here this schema of the continuum we get. So first we apply the notion of change of placement that I mentioned many times up to now. So if apply the notion of change of placement, I have the two macro categories I already introduced, that of dynamicity without motion and that of motion in the broad sense. And as here we have change of placement with respect to the terrestrial framework, and here we don't have any change of placement, we can state that these categories, basic categories of eventualities or verbs, are more dynamic than these ones in terms of displacement. These ones, for instance, changes of posture like s'asseoir, etc., are closer to staticness than verbs like marcher or a verb like entrer. And then this is the first notion, change of placement. And then if you apply the notion of update of location, the only category that truly update the location of the target is the motion in the strict sense that we described, because it includes not only a change of placement here, but a change of relation with respect to the target. So we can arrange the whole. This is a way to say that all verbs of movement and motion are not dynamic in the same way, and we can really arrange them along a continuum of dynamicity from those at the left end that are closer to staticness to those which are the most dynamic strict motion verbs. So to conclude, summing up the key features of the framework, so the approach is based on two notions, the notions of change of placement and that of change of basic locative relation. The interaction of these two notions allow to arrange the whole domain of movement and motion. We could define two macro categories of verbs and eventualities: spatial dynamicity without motion displacement and motion in the broad sense. And within these macro categories, we can define each time two basic categories: change of disposition, simple change of relation, motion in the weak sense, and strict motion. And each basic category of verbs can in turn divide into subcategories. Probably I will leave this part because I already commented it. I just want to say some words about, finally I will not go into the alternative typology to Talmi's, but it's just to give you an idea. In fact, there are many problems with the path and manner approach, not only for the reason put forward by Levinson and Wilkins that proved that it could not be applied to a sample of languages with a dozen of languages, but the notion itself, the two notions themselves have several problems. For instance, if I take the notion of path, most of the time there is no definition of the notion. Talmi provides one, but other authors not. And even when they are working in Talmi's framework, it is not evident that they use Talmi's definition. And in fact, even in formal works, you show that it's not clear what is the ontological status of the notion of path. Whether it is an eventuality, for instance, or the spatial track of an eventuality. If I move, I leave a track on the ground, or some people process it as a material physical entity which is independent of the target and of the eventuality which is previously existing. It is not make clear either which kind of space, which is the nature of the space which is associated to this notion of path. Van der Waals' work and the work I made with Lorvieux many years ago proved that in fact the space which is involved in spatial description is very different from the mathematical space. It is not an absolute space with coordinates. It's a relational relative space. Most of the time the descriptions are imprecise, incomplete. For instance, if I say the cat is in front of the chair, I don't provide you what is the exact distance between the cat and the chair. And many variations can arise. Not only is it's a different geometry, but like Van der Waals proved, there are many functional notions like forces, orientation, etc. There are many problems also for the definition of path that come from the methodology that was used for defining it with pictorial or schematic representations, and mainly data coming from English, in fact. As I just told you, the main semantic and pragmatic function of dynamic spatial descriptions, which is to make easier the search for the target, and so to be able to update the location of the moving target, is not taken into account in many studies. There are also many problems with the notion of manner, probably because often it is taken as a completely intuitive notion that does not need any definition because it's so evident what is manner, and so researchers most of the time do not provide any definition. But recently, Slobin and colleagues made an interesting paper about manner, but especially in French, Dejan Stojic and Estelle Moulin made very interesting works about this notion, not only for space, manner in general, and how it can be defined. And as a result of Dejan Stojic's work, some properties that were usually considered as falling under path in Talmi's approach are indeed manner properties. For instance, the shape of motion or shape of trajectory, like zigzagé, louvoyer, slalomé, spiralé, are manner properties in Stojic framework and not path properties. And in fact, just to go back to the notion of update of location, to be able to update the location, when you say Max went into the wall, Max left, Max arrived, you update the location of the target, and you know before or after the eventuality where Max was located. But if you say Max zigzagged or waved or slalomed or spiraled, you don't say anything about Max's location. So here there is not update of location. I will leave this side, and just to say you that an alternative approach compatible with Levinson and Wilkins' criticism which consists in proposing other notions is probably possible. It should be based on the fundamental semantic and pragmatic function of spatial description, that of search domain of the target and update of location. And I think I have to go deeper in this direction, but I think that the two notions are used for the categorization of eventualities in French could be applied to other languages and could be interesting for the languages. And So it's something I will want to develop the next years, to propose an alternative typology to that of TALMI, just indicating that manner is important, but it's something which is not, in my opinion, directly involved in the typology. It's a by consequence of the typology, but it is not directly involved in the typology. So it is something on which I'm already working, and probably some years ago I can present you the outcomes of my reflections.
Well, thank you very much.
It's just the name of the research program. It's not a project, the overall research program within which I made this work, and with some PhDs also in between, and also the name was the Description, Expérimentation et Formalisation du déplacement dans la langue. But mainly here I presented the descriptive aspects, but last 2-3 years I tried to formalize it in predicate logic, quite simple formalization. That's something I will put on the web next weeks. And from the experimental aspect, we didn't, in this case, we didn't make any psycholinguistic experiment, but with a colleague in Toulouse, we made very interesting experiments of teaching to children of primary school around Toulouse to use this framework, not directly the framework, but for to analyze the data, but to tell them to classify some verbs and to try to see whether the criterion they used, in particular the semantic criterion they used to classify the verbs, matched what is proposed in the categorization. And it was a very nice experience.
Time for questions, comments, discussion. You don't want me to leave me.
I have some stupid questions. One is just methodological. Can you put a slide with your macro categories, basic categories?
Right.
So, I don't know, I'm just curious, it's just, you call the macro categories the two columns, right?
Mm-hmm.
The question is, why are the columns more important than the rows? Why are not the rows, which are the macro category? Why? You know?
No, it's because I put the criterion of change of placement here. If I have put it, the criterion to determine macro categories is whether there is change of placement or not. If I had put this criterion here and that of change of basic locative relation here, the macro categories would have been here, but I don't have an idea of for the reason of my choice. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, but it could be the other way. Yes.
More substantial. I mean, I was thinking, well, you know, maybe it's the criterion is the change or not. Or
yeah. And just that it is change of placement, no change of placement. And,
So then in slides 18 and 19, well, a previous question about those are, in general, I mean, I don't know about French, but in English, many of the verbs here seems to not require to have explicit clause telling the source and the target, you said, right? So all the verbs imply that there is a source, I mean, an initial placement, and there is a change, so there is another, and at the end. But sentences are grammatical without being explicit about them, right? So that's what so they would be like, well, according to him, an articulated constituents, something like that, something that belong to the eventuality, you'd say, or belong to the state of affairs or whatever, to the event, but they are not represented in the syntax, or not necessarily represented in the syntax. Okay, but then, this is my question, maybe it's an objection, I don't know. For me, it's a little bit dogmatic to say that the verb in English, maybe French is different, that the verb to go out asserts first are, that it's in some place, and then negates that there is a change from being in the place to not being in the place. Well, and I would say, well, that's if you interpret something like to go out from. But if you are interpreting like to go out to the cafeteria, for instance, it's the opposite. It wasn't in the cafeteria, and now in his way to the cafeteria, or something like that. And the same with the others, right? So if you to go in from or to go into, so it seems like maybe you have a default interpretation that takes, as you said in the last slide, that first you fix like the source, the initial position, but well, if you don't have any preposition, you don't know which of those. So that's my question, objection.
I agree. Probably I can start with the second, the case of English. No, I totally agree for the case of English, and I think that it is directly related to the fact go itself in French also. Now aller is aléa, it's a final, mainly a final verb. But if you take the Joan in Euskera, Joan in principle is an italic verb. Iritik joan da, bihorduz. It's an italic verb. And in French, it was also the case in diachrony. Aller was an italic verb. And you could... Italic, with no transition, which is not bounded. It's a motion which is not bounded. You can move without any constraints of boundedness. So, for instance, in French, no, it is very literary and in all the text, but you can find sentences like il est allé par la rue, and it's the use of par, which is the same in Spanish. Fue por la calle, or ando por la calle. Il est allé par la ville pendant des heures. But it's something very literary now, and most people use aller with a final landmark. And I think that in English, Go maintained this idea of non-boundedness, that you can go through the city during 4 2 hours, so it is not a manner verb, but as is a simple change of placement without any boundary, like a verb of manner, then you can associate it with a series of without a satellite. It doesn't indicate anything, but then you can associate several satellites. You can say he went out to, through, and this is a very a property of also English manner verbs. He ran out of Slovene mention funny examples like this where you can have the manner verbs and then a list of satellites. So he ran out of, through, to, or down. And it's more or less the same phenomenon. I mean that go is not obviously manner verbs, but its basic semantics is not bounded. It's a simple change of placement, contrary to aller in French. And then that's the reason for which you can associate it with out, from, to, etc. So I don't think that it is in contradiction with using the same tools I proposed here. I would formalize or characterize the semantics of Go only with a change of placement, not with any landmark or. And the second question with respect to the arguments that are not always instantiated or in the. I completely agree, and I wrote a paper, but it isn't in the list 3 or 4 years ago, about this source-goal opposition or asymmetry in French, what people call the goal bias. I mean, there is a bias towards specifying the goal, because there is a nice opposition in French between initial and final verbs, because it seems that for most initial verbs, for instance, as they are, probably I will show you just this schema. Partir, for instance, but is the same thing for sortir. You see that the event consists of a change of relation and a concomitant change of placement. For instance, to not be not to be at and to not be at, or to be in and not to not be in for sortir. So it is centered on the event and on the landmark also. And this has a nice effect because in many discourse situations, you are not, you can use the verb if in the discourse model the landmark has been introduced previously. You are not obliged to specify it. You can say Max est entré dans le magasin, Max went into or into the room, he looked for, and then he left. And in French, the same thing. Il est entré dans la salle, il a cherché, il a fouillé dans ses affaires. 2 minutes après, il est sorti, ou il est parti. And that's, but when, and this is true for most of initial verbs, and it is an interesting phenomenon. But for final verbs, it is not always the case. For instance, for aller, aléa, you can say, if you want to say Max est allé à Donostia, you can say, you cannot say Max est allé. In French, it's not possible. Max est allé. You have to use a clitic, for instance. Donostia est une belle ville, Max y est allé. This is possible in other languages. For instance, in Basque, in Euskera, if you put, if the landmark is sufficiently salient in discourse, Donostia or Parixe hiri ederra kepa joan da. Nik esango nuke ara joan da. Uste dut, baina frantsesez ezin da, in French it's completely grammatical, but I will say that in Euskara also you will have the tendency to to make the goal explicit. But you will find examples without, if the goal is sufficiently salient. And yeah.
Maybe this is, I was thinking in English, at least, that can be related to the unarticulate constituent thing. I mean, in English, you cannot say he went. You need something else. Yeah, you cannot say he went. You can say he went out, or he left. It's different. He left, you can say, with no out. But my question is that we say he went out. My point was that it's not necessarily initial, in my humble opinion, initial or final. It depends on your discourse situation or whatever. So it can be starting from asserting to denying, or the other way around. That was my question with English.
But you can say he did go.
No.
You can say he went, but if you're kind of
No.
confirming something in a conversation, like you say,
That's not grammatical. It's,
you can go, really go as if he went. It's a kind of like,
but that's elliptical. Clearly, that's clearly elliptical. No. But you, then take another example. Take something like, you can say I finished, but I cannot say I end. You have to say I ended it or something like that. I ended. I mean, you need it. I mean, the explicit articulation of an object. And sometimes the out also seems that helps changing that in English. But then, my objection was, I don't know, well, maybe in French is the case. But in English, it's like...
In English, the reason is that go is really a change of placement. So a consequence that it does not introduce any argument in principle. But even in English, like in ILCLI for Joan, probably in corpuses in ILCLI you find much more Joan without a landmark that express an initial exactly partir, joan da, kepa hor da, ez joan da. Ez joan da norapait edo, ez joan da. And in English also, many people will say he left, but he went 2 minutes ago, he left, without indicating the initial argument. And so there is a kind of, and what it is interesting for explaining this contrast between partir and aller, for instance, is that here, as I told you, the whole event is centered on change of relation and concomitant change of placement, and thus in the discourse, in the landmark that is present. While here, for aller, for instance, this is not the case for venir because it has deixis, but for aller, you have a change of placement followed by a change of relation. And most of the time, even pragmatically, when you see somebody working, you don't know what is if he has a goal, you don't know what is his goal, and you have to specify it. While even in final relation for entrée, which is the symmetric of sortir, you can say j'étais dans la pièce, Max est entré. So there is really an asymmetry between all the initial verbs which are centered on the event and on the landmark listens the implicitness of the goal of the source of the initial landmark, but it's not always the case for the final ones. Probably because of this, I proposed in this paper that is because here it is centered on the change of relation and placement and on the landmark, while here it is not centered on the landmark. Here the landmark is not known. In many discursive situations, you don't know where Max is going to. He's just walking, and you have to specify the final. And that's probably for the reasons also for which it's not so grammaticalized that than in French, where the glyptic E, the pronoun, is obligatory. But it was interesting. My feeling was that even in euskera, bon, parixe, hiri eder bada, kepa joan da, bon, baliteke. Baina on the reverse, saying duela 5 minutu kepa hor zen, baina joan da. For the initial one, there is no problem to implicit it. Baina egin ez dugu erabiltzen iparraldean bat ere. Hile egin, joan egin ez. Hori goaldekoa da, oso.
Yeah, so it's more of a comment than a question, I think, because I saw some relation between some work that I'm more familiar with. So some years ago, a philosopher called Peter Gardenfors proposed to use a framework called the conceptual spaces framework that he proposes as a way of doing lexical semantics. And so the idea is that for each category of linguistic expressions, you would choose a space and you would represent the meaning of these expressions in that space. So for example, you may have a space of actions for verbs. And then, the problem would be to locate the appropriate space in which to sort of represent the semantic features of these expressions of verbs. And he published a book on that, where he proposed some projects. One of the examples was that of verbs. And I mention it because you mentioned that maybe some formal frameworks would be useful. You mentioned predicate logic, but the whole point of the conceptual spaces program was to say, well, if there is something like spatial content in the meanings of certain expressions, then maybe a way to just basically represent that is to use a mathematical space for that. And but I was wondering whether it would be of any use for some of the distinctions that were here, and maybe in the case of polarity, there was one situation where you had like go in, right? The agent is not there, and then happens to be there, and then the other one where the agent is there, they go out, right? And then it's not there anymore, right? But there were no cases where the agent maybe is at the threshold or at the edge of a certain place, like to step on the line of the metro or to step on the edge of the cliff, where the agent somehow it's at the boundary of two regions, right? Because maybe I misremember, but maybe there were cases of it's in that state and then it's not in that state anymore, right? But maybe there's cases where the agent is at the boundary between two states or between two locations, and that's a sort of distinction that can be represented if you represent it spatially, right? Because then the object would be at the boundary between the two regions, and then you can make sense of that if you have a spatial representation, which may be a bit harder if it's predicate logic, let's say, because if you represent that as a negation, then you only have two choices, right? It's either not there or it's there, and this sort of negation-like behavior, spatial negation-like behavior, can be well represented with the space. So yeah, like it was. That's why I said it was more of a comment than because I don't know how I would ask anything in this way, but that there seems to be some connection between these two fields, and that maybe there's some interesting ways to make them relate. I don't know if you thought about it. And related to that, there's also this sort of formal frameworks called, like, broadly fall under the category logics of space. Like some of them are related to mereology, and so and they make sometimes similar distinctions. And I mentioned this because you also said that the space that seems to be pointed at by the meanings of the expression we use doesn't seem to be sort of Euclidean space, or the sort of space we use in physics or so, right? It seems to be a bit more rudimentary in a sense, right? There's no distances. Maybe there's something like that thing is close to this one, or this thing is between these two, or this is far away, or too far away, or nearby. And these are the sort of distinctions that we care about when we locate objects by talking about them, right? And so some of these formal frameworks, they basically take as basic these notions, right? Or something being inside another thing, or something be or near enough another thing, instead of assuming that there is some sort of distance that we can measure, or angles that we can measure. And just to say that there's also other formal frameworks that may be also useful for some of the distinctions, because there were a lot. So
No, what I can say about this, I read some papers of some years ago of Peter Gardenforth, when he started proposing this representation of semantic content with semantic spaces. I had the impression that he tried to formalize ideas that previously came from cognitive linguistics, like Langaker's one, and I have to say I didn't develop it, but I'm a bit critical with this representation without formalizing them of cognitive linguistics with schemas, etc., because they tend to, they have two defaults. One is to reduce all the semantics of space to geometry, because it's much more difficult to represent forces and with these tools. And many times, for instance, Talmy used forces, but not for space, mainly for discourse connectors, etc. And most of the time, he reduces the semantics of spatial prepositions, for instance, to purely geometrical schemata. So this one of the defaults I found in these approaches. And the second one is that many times it's not clear, but representing the semantic of a verb with a schema, even formalized, has the risk to tend towards a Cartesian and coordinates approach of space. While in the work with law review, etc., we clearly showed that linguistic space, as I said, is not based on coordinates like you said before. And even if we didn't never make it, but if we made an experiment with subjects and show them even in a small space with different landmarks, different trajectories like or paths, like some researchers call them, and then try to we show them different eventualities with several chairs or other objects, and with different paths of target who move. And then in a second step, we ask people to draw on a paper the exact trajectory the target has made. But most people are as human beings, we are not endowed with some things in the brain which is able of remember exactly what are during a motion event the exact position of the target during. What we can say that, for instance, and we can remember it, that he went from the left of the chair to the right of the tree, and then through, I don't know, but the exact trajectory within an experiment most subject will be unable of retrieving it. And that's because we simply don't remember it. Our brain, at least but there were experiments not in cognitive linguistics, not only for language, showed that our space is really relative. That we are able to say that an entity is in front of another, on or in another, but we don't function on the basis of exact coordinates. So to go back to Peter Gardenforth, I'm always a bit suspicious about intents to represent everything with imagistic, even in logic, representation. And there is and it is related to the debate in AI nowadays, a debate to know whether we have to represent everything with imagistic tools, or also with symbolic elements. And my idea is that, for instance, many grammatical and lexical information are in fact symbolic more than imagistic. Then when we are in an act of reference, we try to make closer our symbolic representation with what goes on in the reality through images. But I'm a bit critical with the intent to reduce the content, the semantic content, to images, even formalized. But I don't know a lot about Gardenforth's implementation. I remember that he tried also to represent many things with vectors, and this is related also with what is made in computer sciences to represent the content of lexicon with vectors. But I follow thinking that symbolic representation, it can be predicate logic or more elaborate logic, but is important to represent grammatical or lexical content, and that not everything can be reduced to images. I don't know if I answer your question.
More questions, comments? No? So maybe we can leave it here. Thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.